Hello, and welcome to day one of the software engineering workshop, TeensInAI AI Accelerator. Today, we're going to talk about Agile. So what is Agile? Well, according to the Agile Alliance, the ability to create and respond to change in order to succeed in an uncertain and turbulent environment. For software engineers, what that really means is that we can build software in a way that we can adapt to change very quickly. One thing you very quickly realize is that customers either change their mind or they don't specify what they want very clearly. And so the ability to pivot and change direction without affecting the overall delivery times is very, very important. And this is where Agile is fantastic at achieving. Around 2001, a group of very experienced software engineers got together and they decided that they needed to come up with a better way to describe what this new way of working was. And so they came up with the Agile Manifesto. The Agile Manifesto has about 4 specific areas that they wanted to focus on. And that was to put people and interactions ahead of processes and tools, working software instead of documentation, customer collaboration instead of contracts, and responding to change instead of following a plan no matter what. The other things are obviously also important, but those 4 key ones are the ones that actually defined Agile as a methodology. The way Agile works is pretty simple. After you get a list of outcomes or features that the customer wants to achieve, we go away and estimate how complex these are, and that entails using people's experience on having built similar things and actually working out, okay, last time I built something similar, it was this hard to do. So it's a measure of the complexity. Then we prioritize them based on what the customer needs in terms of I need this feature before that feature, or I need to get to market first with this particular set of capabilities. And once that's agreed, we go ahead and just build small pieces of the puzzle to arrive to those things that are at the top of the priority list, those small deliveries. We very quickly get feedback from the customer as to what we've done and whether it meets their expectations. And then we iterate on that process. And the idea is that if you do that on a regular basis, you get through a lot of work. You don't get any nasty surprises like you used to do with the older methods where the customer wouldn't see an output for months and months on end. And you improve constantly. And that's one of the key parts of Agile is that self-improvement. There's lots of different Agile frameworks. We're going to cover a couple of them in this workshop, which are Scrum and Kanban. But there are other things like stream programming and many others that sort of stick to the same values but apply them in slightly different ways. So why do Agile instead of something else? Well, before Agile was around, most companies used to work with this method called waterfall. Some companies still do, although the majority of tech companies now do Agile. The waterfall methodology, basically, the name says it all. It meant that you would do a piece of work and then it would be followed by another one, another one, so that you start with a big architecture, a big design, then you keep going down to start building the whole process, then you keep through testing, then you go through effectively writing the reports and showing the customers. And this could take 6, 12, 18 months before the customer actually saw the output of this. And that was one of the biggest problems because, time moves. In 18 months, the customer probably didn't need the same thing that they asked for 18 months ago, or they may have not been clear enough as to what they wanted, and you've actually been building completely the wrong thing. So Agile came along to realize that, we need to course correct quickly. We need to get that feedback quickly so that we can continue to be on track to achieve the goals that the client wants without having to waste lots of time and effort. So because Agile works in much smaller time periods and it's fully transparent as to what it does and it shares its progress constantly with the people who need to know, we avoid this sort of going down the wrong direction. It involves the customer throughout the process. So that means that there are no surprises at all. And the idea is that Agile aims to deliver value very early and very often. So effectively, the smallest piece of work that you can deliver that actually shows progress is what you should be doing in your list of priorities. I did mention that there are quite a few Agile frameworks out there. And there is a reason for that. The reason being that there are lots of different industries, lots of different backgrounds to how people evolved into writing software. And every organization is different, the cultures are different. And so lots of different approaches have evolved. Some of those have been formalized into actual frameworks, although lots of companies use the Agile principles, but they don't really stick to a particular framework. That's okay. The idea is that they all follow these principles of quick delivery, self-introspection, consult with the customer regularly, change direction when needed. That sort of principle is true of all these different frameworks. Software engineering is one of the fields that changes the quickest, and I'm sure everybody knows technology moves very, very fast. And to build technology, you have to move even faster. And so basically, we're always looking for ways to improve, ways to use new methods to make things easier, more reliable, more repeatable, which means that we can build software at high quality in a very short period of time. Now, the two most common methodologies are called Kanban and Scrum, and those are the two that I'm going to sort of cover in today's workshop. There are plenty others. I think these two are the most common across the industry, and I think you will find them very useful to know about them, and probably to use one of them, if not both combined, through your next 2 weeks of your accelerator whilst you build your project. So first, a very quick introduction to Kanban. I'm not going to teach you everything. I'm not going to do a demo of how it works. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, and I put there in the Find Out More section a link where you can actually learn a lot about Kanban and how to use it and how people use it on a day-to-day basis. Kanban comes from the Japanese word for visual signal or card, and historically the theory is they came from Toyota. Toyota noticed that they were wasting a lot of stock in the factory. They were doing things that were very inefficient, and they realized that there was, because not everybody saw what was happening, not everybody knew where things were, and so they sort of looked around and realized the supermarkets stocked things in the supermarket, and they very rarely called their stockists to bring more until their shelves were starting to be very, very empty. So this sort of just-in-time delivery was something that fascinated Toyota, and so they started this concept of Kanban. And the whole point of Kanban is that you visualize the work, so you make sure that everybody knows the work in total that you have to do. And that's, if you look at that board at the top right, you can see that there's a section that says to do with some sticky notes on. There's a section that says doing and a section that says done. So I can have a look and quickly see, what's been worked on, what's already been done, and what's left to do. So that's how we visualize our work. Another key part of Kanban is called limiting the work in process. The work in process is how many things you have in the doing pile. And you want to make sure that that's a limited number, so like 3, 4, 5 items at any given time. Because if lots of work is in progress, that probably means that you're actually leaving some work halfway, so you can go and do something else, and so things get lost in the mess, and you have lots of things that never get finished. So the idea here is that you put very few items in the doing column, and you make sure they're done and move them to the done column before you pick another one from to do. So the whole point is that you focus on that flow, how the things go from one end of the board to the other. And the whole point of Kanban's transparency is the fact that because you can see what's in work, you can see who's working, you can see what's actually getting stuck in the pipe, because there may be blockers, what we call blockers, things that don't allow you to finish that card. You always strive for continuous improvement, and you always identify when things went wrong, and you go back and make that improvement, so that next time you do another piece of the puzzle and move it along the board, hopefully you avoid that pitfall again. And so Kanban is very light. It's a very light touch system that allows you to do this sort of project very quickly and very nicely organized. And as I mentioned on the introduction of this workshop, Trello is a great tool to do Kanban. It's a tool that shows you very, very much a digital version of that board that you have there on the screen. It just allows you to move those pieces, those cards from to do, doing to done. You can create your own columns. You can be a bit more specific. Those colors for the cards can mean who's working on them, or it can mean what type of work it is, if it's front end, back end, or user interface, that sort of stuff. So, it's entirely up to you. Kanban is very easy to work with, very easy to modify. So, you can make it your own very quickly so that everybody's happy with how the process works. Now, that was a very quick overview of Kanban. Scrum is a slightly more heavyweight, very process-oriented, very strict as to how it does things. And yet it's probably one of the most used, probably more used than Kanban. Kanban is more for smaller projects that need to move fast, early startup process. When you get to the bigger grown-up scale-up companies, you start getting more into the Scrums, which accommodate very large groups of teams and allows you to do bigger projects. It's definitely, together with Kanban, the most popular of Agile methodologies. Everybody does Scrum one way or another, although, there is no such thing as the perfect Scrum. Everybody adapts it for their environment, and that's okay. If someone tells you they're doing textbook Scrum, they're probably lying, because there is no such thing. It's designed to be adaptable. The key to Scrum are the 3 pillars. So the whole point of Scrum is that it has 3 key principles by which everything else derives from and it gets its value from. So those are transparency, which means you get visibility of the process at all points to the people who need to see. So I can see where my work in progress is, I can see who's doing what, I can see whether something's stuck, and I can help to unstick it. So that transparency allows everybody to see where we are, and there's no hiding behind anything. It allows you to expose all your problems as well as your successes. And when you expose problems, you tend to find people help on resolving those. And so hopefully in the next iteration, the problems has gone away, and therefore it allows you to move faster and faster and faster. This is the part of inspection, and that's, how are we doing on what we're building towards the goals that we need to achieve? Are we actually building the right things? Are we getting to build what the client wanted? And this constant inspection means that you keep an eye on the direction, and if you're deviating from the goal you want to achieve or from what the client wants you to build, you can very quickly course correct. That's something Waterfall would have never done. Waterfall stuck to the plan no matter what, and when they got to the end, they realized they'd done everything wrong and wasted months and months of work. Scrum is designed to exactly avoid that situation. And with that comes adaptation, the ability to change direction to avoid getting away from those goals that you want to achieve. That's the most important part. You have to recognize that you've gone wrong, or that you change your requirements because things change, the industry moves on, people need different things tomorrow. And so you have to have the ability to change without breaking the system. And that's something that Agile in general and Scrum in particular does very, very well. The Scrum process is based on 5 events. We used to call them ceremonies, but I think that sounds too weird, so we now call them events. And I'll show you in a tiny bit a diagram that shows what they mean. The events are the sprint, which is the actual time cycle by which you start working on something and you finish working on that something, and that's a defined time-boxed space, generally 2 weeks, although it can vary between 1 and 4 weeks normally. Then you have sprint planning, which is how you actually decide what you're going to work on the next sprint, so that by the time the sprint arrives, you already have a list of all the things you think you're going to be able to do in those next 2 weeks or 4 week cycles. Then there's the daily Scrum, and that's where the name comes from. It's a bit like rugby, is when everybody gets together, heads together, and discuss very, very quickly. We call it a stand-up because you tend to get people to stand up so they don't get comfortable, so the meeting is short. And that's where you discuss what you've done yesterday and what you plan on doing today, and if you have any blockers that anybody can help resolve. Then there's the sprint review, which is what happens towards the end of the sprint when you've already built and you think you've achieved the done state for all the work you had to do. And that's where the team gets together and they do demos, they show what they've achieved. It's a time for celebration because you've done your work for 2, 3, 4 weeks on something, and you want to show that you deliver value. You're not left something halfway. You've actually gone from the beginning to end and you have something to show. And ultimately, but very, very important, is the retrospective. The retrospective is the point where after you've done the week or 2 weeks work, the sprint itself, you've probably came across friction points. You came across things like, I wish that thing wasn't there. I wish this was easier. Or, you know what, I think we've done this fantastic this time. So things that you want to keep doing, things that you want to do more of, and things that you want to do less of. And that's the retrospective. That's where everybody gets together and they put that list together and they vote on what things they want to get rid of or what things they want to do more of. So that if you do that on a constant basis every sprint, you will get a team that works fantastically together. They iron all the kinks and they make sure that everything is smooth and it works very, very, very fast. And that means that high performance, fast delivery, high quality, which is what we all strive for in software engineering. Finally, the 3 artifacts, the things that actually make Scrum work, the things that actually produce value. The product backlog, which is where we put every single item that we want to eventually build. And that's your list of features. It could be something much bigger, like a group of features or a whole section of the product. And that's something that's basically your full equivalent to the to-do column in Kanban, but this covers everything that you've thought of that the product will do in the future as well as now. Then there's the sprint backlog, which is a subset of the product backlog that's been broken down into much smaller pieces, much more well understood. And then they're just the items that you're going to work on for this sprint only. So it only has 2 weeks worth of work or something like that, however long the sprint is. And the increment is where we actually then deposit the outcome of the sprint backlog after the sprint has gone through the whole process and you've actually written the code, tested it, validated it, you're happy that you built what you need, you put it into the increment box, and that's effectively a new release. You've now produced a new increment in the release number, and you now have a product that has more features because you've worked over that sprint cycle to deliver those new features. So basically, this is the minimum amount of things that you need to plan, execute, and review the sprint. A very important part of Scrum is the roles. There are 3 key roles to building a Scrum team. And those are listed here. So you have the product owner, and that's the most important role in terms of they understand what the product should do. They face the interests of the project team, as well as act as the expert, and they represent the customer. So they understand ultimately what the product is, what the priorities should be, what we're building as a team. And this is the person you go to and ask, I have doubts about this particular piece of work. What should I do? And then they should have the answer. They are the ultimate product experts. Then you have the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master acts, I call it the protector of the team. They make sure that everyone in the project is available, they can do their work, there's nothing blocking them, there's no distractions, and if there are, he'll go and stop them and make sure that people can actually do their work. They are experts on how Scrum works, and they're the experts of the process. So if you have any confusion as to how Scrum works, they're the ones to go to and speak to. And they will be the ones that actually stand there with you, the stand-up, make people, make sure that everybody speaks at the stand-up, make sure that they ask the questions, they mention what should happen in every one of the 5 events. They sort of ensure the process is sleek and it runs. And obviously the most important part of the team is the development team members. So these are the people who are actually going to build the software, the people who actually make things happen. Generally, a Scrum team goes ideal size between 5 and 9 people. If it gets any bigger, you break it down into 2 teams. 9 is probably a little bit big already. And it generally includes all sorts of functional roles in there. So it could be the designer, the developers, the data scientists, anybody you need to deliver the piece of work that the sprint requires you to deliver is part of that team. So I promised you before that I was going to show you a diagram as to how the Scrum framework works. And this is a very good diagram. It comes from the Scrum.org organization, people who are actually responsible for Scrum. And you can see from left to right the process that we follow from the definition of the product backlog, and you can see those squares are different sizes. That just means the bigger the size, the more complex the chunk of the product, and probably the less defined that is, because we haven't got to the point where we understand it enough. We know there's a big functionality that we need to add, and so we make them those big blocks. The smaller the blocks, the more well understood. The smaller the feature, the smaller the detail, and so we have a lot of ideas. And you can see there's a circle, arrow, because we're constantly reviewing the product backlog. Products change, and we know that. That's how Waterfall was falling over. Definition changes whilst we're building the product, and so we have to be always looking at the product backlog and making sure it's still relevant. Now, at the beginning of the sprint, we'll have the sprint planning. The sprint planning will take a number of stories at the top of the priority list from the product backlog, and it will then decide which ones go into the sprint backlog. And those, see how the sprint backlog squares are much smaller. The well-defined stories, the things that are understood, their complexity levels, and we've taken enough from the product backlog in terms of complexity blocks to actually make sure that we deliver in the space of the sprint itself. So let's assume we have a 2-week sprint. We have 5 developers, and we know consistently those 5 developers can deliver a certain amount of work of certain level of complexity, and so the sprint backlog will be populated through the sprint planning with enough work to be able to commit to deliver that work in those 2 weeks. And that's what the sprint backlog is for. The sprint backlog then goes into this circular Scrum team repeat process, and that's where the teams constantly work every day. They pick stories from the backlog, they go away and build them, and then they pick the next task and the next task and the next task within the stories. And that daily Scrum at the top is showing you that at the beginning of the day or at some point during the day, depends on where you're located, you will get that meeting with the whole team where you discuss what you did yesterday, what you will do today, and what your problems are if you have any, so people can help you. Ultimately, after that cycle is finished, those 2 weeks in this example of work are finished, you go into the sprint review where the team meet, and you show what you've achieved as a team. You show what you achieve individually as stories. If there are demos to be done, that's where you happen. That's where you can invite external parties like the client or stakeholders within your larger company or organization, and then they can see what's been achieved in that 2-week cycle in this case. The very, very important thing is when that's approved and everybody agrees that the stories have been done and we've met the requirements, they get them put into the increment box, which effectively is just giving us that sort of new release of the software. And at the same time, we've learned a lot through this 2-week process, and so we want to have that sprint retrospective, which allows us to go back to sprint planning with the improvements we've decided to apply through the retrospective. We eliminate things that we don't like anymore, or we do less things that we don't like, and we do more things that we like that resulted very effective in the previous sprint. And ultimately, after quite a few cycles, say in about 3 months' time, this team will be slick because they would have discovered what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And this is what I said about Scrum not being fully defined, because every team will discover different things based on their personalities, based on their skills, and so you will end up with an improved team overall. Scrum is great at improving what the team does. So a question that I'm asked quite often is, should we use Kanban or should we use Scrum? And the answer is never the same. The question here is, Kanban applies to certain types of projects and it works really well for those, and Scrum applies for others. You can use them intermixed, you can use them separately, you can use them for the same type of projects. It depends how light a process you need. For a very short project with lots of small activities, Kanban is ideal because it allows you to put those post-its on the wall or on the digital board in Trello and say, well, we need to achieve these things. We have 3 people to carry this through. Let's limit the work in progress to 3 and move them across the board. And so for projects that get things that appear ad hoc, that they're not planned, like for example bugs, if a customer calls and says there's a bug in your software, you can have a Kanban sort of pipeline that allows you to solve those sort of problems that come along that you don't know whether they're going to appear or not. You could have an empty board for a while and then suddenly a bunch of them appear and you need to work through them quickly. So Kanban is great for that because it doesn't need planning as much as, say, Scrum. It also means that because you have this sort of collective team that has less defined roles, everybody can pick tasks from the board, get on with them, and then put them back into the done column sort of thing. So it allows you that much more flexible way of doing things. If you're going to do a much more complex project, something that's big, something that has well-defined roles within the team, you have data scientists, you have engineers for the front end, engineers for the back end, that sort of process, Scrum is better. It allows you to manage those resources better, it allows you to define the processes and iterate with that retrospective we were talking about, which means that you get a much better improvement into the process specifically designed for the makeup of your team. If there's lots of changes coming into the definition of the product that you're building, Scrum is great at keeping those in check and making sure that actually they don't affect the deliverables. You don't waste too much time. You can see in the next iteration, in the next sprint, you can also already introduce those changes so that you're constantly every week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever your sprint cycle is, course correct. And so you're always moving forwards. You don't go in completely wrong directions for a very long time, which is a very useful part of Scrum. So that's a quick overview of Agile and Kanban and Scrum, which are the 2 methodologies or frameworks that I think you will be more likely to use going forward. So I'd like to set you a few challenges for today. So for the rest of the hour or 2 hours that you want to spend on this on day 1. These are the things I'd like you to do. So I'd like you to have a look in those links that I added at the beginning of the presentation about learning more about Kanban and Scrum. I think it's fascinating. You can. There's lots of YouTube videos about how to do it. You can ask your mentors how to do it during the next few weeks. I think what's very, very important is that you see how others do it in the real world, because you will learn a lot from just watching a 15-minute video. Then based on that, I want you to think about the next few weeks. So in the next few weeks, you're going to be asked to build a project or a product with your teammates. And to do that effectively, and as a true software engineer, you're going to have to use a method, a framework. And that framework could be Kanban, could be Scrum, or, I've used Scrumban before. You can look it up. Scrumban is a bit of a mixture between the 2. It takes the agility of Kanban and some of the structure of Scrum. It allows you to do projects quickly, while still having some more rigid methodologies within there. So that normally applies for slightly bigger teams, but have a look, see what you think. I want you to think about, if you know what projects you're going to be working on in the next 2 weeks, what framework would be the most appropriate for what you want to achieve. And then in the process of this, it won't hurt to create a Trello account. I know I mentioned it at the very beginning in the intro. I think it's great to have a Trello account. You can use it for your own personal projects. You can use it for things that you do at home. It doesn't have to be for this, but I think it's good to get used to it and see how it works, and have a digital Kanban board that you can play with. And it's free, so go in and have fun with it. And this is an important one, and this applies to every day. Don't be afraid to ask your mentors. If you have questions that you've come up through watching this video, or that you've been thinking about for a while, you're gonna have access to some of the most talented people in the industry in all fields: software engineering and AI, and anything around design, creative thinking, etc. So don't be afraid to ask questions to the people who are the experts, because they were once in your shoes. At some point they just started their career and they didn't know enough, and now all we want to do is share our knowledge with you guys, so you can be the next generation and leap in with a lot of knowledge already given for you. So please take notes, ask questions, and talk to people, talk to your teammates, talk to your mentors. Just make sure that you don't get stuck when you shouldn't be. And with that, we've reached the end of day one. I hope you follow some of the challenges and try and go out there and do some investigations and decisions. And I look forward to seeing you on day 2. Goodbye.